Hello, everybody. So, in this chapter, we'll be talking about fluids, electrolytes, and the importance of pH balance in the body. If you are going into nursing, this is one of the most important chapters to understand. So, our cells require maintenance of homeostasis to function properly. And homeostasis of the cell depends on three different balances. First, maintenance of the fluid balance, which is the amount of water in the body. And then you have electrolyte balance, which is the ions that are released by dissociation of inorganic compounds to conduct an electrical impulse in, say, muscle cells or nerve cells or cell-to-cell communication, right? So electrolyte balance is very, very important. And then you have acid-base balance. Now, acid-base balance is also extremely important because the cells in our body function at an optimum pH, which is in between 7.35 to 7.45 in the range. Now, if any of these three balances get disrupted, it can lead to disruption in the cellular biochemical reactions. And sometimes it is not so harmful, but in extreme cases, it can even cause death. So it is very important to understand the three homeostatic balances that cells require to function properly. Okay. Our cells float in, we are a big sack of water, right? But our total body water composition changes with age, and the volume of water we have also changes with age, right? Now, different genders also have different compositions. But when we are born as a baby, all infants have about 73 to 75% of their body made up of water. And in young males, they have about 50 to 60% water, whereas young females have about 50% water, a lot less than males, right? And in the older people, the elderly above 70, their total body percentage is reduced to about 45%. So the composition and the total body volume changes with age and body mass and the relative amount of body fat you have as well. Why? We'll just take a look at just a minute. Now, gender differences in body is usually due to the fact that females have more body fat and less skeletal muscles than males in general. And the least hydrated body tissue is adipose tissue, which is just fat tissue. And adipose tissue only contain about 20% water. The rest of it is just fat. And that's why in women, the average amount of total body is lesser than in males. Okay, so people in general, whether male or female, people with greater muscle mass will have more body water because they have more skeletal muscle, right? Skeletal muscle is made up of about 75% water. The the fluids in the body are highly compartmentalized, and each compartment varies in the fluid volume and composition. Now, water and electrolytes move in and out. Electrolytes move with the help of transmembrane channels, and water moves in and out usually via osmosis uh, through aquaporin proteins, right? So the two main compartments of the body are intracellular compartments and extracellular compartments, and the fluid contained within the intracellular compartment is called intracellular fluid. Intracellular means within the cell membrane, okay? And extracellular means outside the cell. So in an average adult who's say 150 pounds, they usually have about 40 liters of total body water content, and out of the 40 liters, they'll have about 65% of the water contained in the cells in the intracellular fluids, right? So that's about 25 liters out of the total 40 liters of body water. The remaining 35% fluids are found in the extracellular region. Now, extracellular fluid includes all the fluids outside the cell, which is about 35 to 37%. Now keep this in mind that no matter if you read different books, these number might slightly vary. So we are just looking at the most common average values over here. Okay, now the extracellular fluid includes the interstitial fluid, the plasma, and something called as the transcellular fluid. The interstitial fluid makes about 25% of the extracellular fluid, and interstitial fluid, if you remember from histology, is the fluid that surrounds all the cells except for blood. Okay, so the fluids in which the cells bathe in is called the interstitial fluid in the tissues. Okay, now the fluid surrounding the blood cells will not be called interstitial fluid, but in a tissue that is made up of a whole bunch of cells, the fluid in which the cells bathe is called the intracellular fluid. About 8% of the fluid makes up blood plasma and the lymphatic fluid. Plasma is basically the liquid portion of blood. Plasma is not the same as serum. Plasma does contain clotting factors. Now, lymphatic fluid is lymph. Lymph is the white color fluid, which is usually composed of lymphocytes and white blood cells. And you find lymphatic fluids in the lymphatic vessels and various cavities of the body, which contain specialized lymphatic tissue. Okay. Now, the main job of the lymphatic system is to return body fluids back to the bloodstream, right? So, a lymphatic system contains a lot of lymphatic fluids. Okay, and then you have transcellular fluid. Now, transcellular fluid is the type of fluid that is contained within the epithelial lined spaces. So spaces that are lined with epithelial cells like the cerebrospinal fluid in the brain, or the synovial cavity, peritoneal cavity, pleural cavity, where you have the serous fluid surrounding the organs in these cavity make up the transcellular fluid. Another example is the vitreous and aqueous humor of the eye, bile fluids, digestive fluids. All of these fluids at some point in the body, these fluids are actually surrounded by spaces that are lined with epithelial tissue, right? So such fluid is called transcellular fluid. So fluid is constantly exchanged between compartments, and the fluids in the intracellular and extracellular region are dissolved, contain water and dissolved nutrients, electrolytes and non-electrolytes, right? So water is a universal solvent, and the solute is the stuff dissolved in water. Like in a mixture of sugar and water, sugar becomes a solute and water becomes the solvent. Okay, electrolytes are inorganic salts and some proteins and acids and bases that dissociate in water to form a charged molecule. So electrolytes play an important role in determining the resting membrane potential of a cell. And then you have non-electrolytes. Non-electrolytes. Non-electrolytes are the type of particles that are created that do not dissociate in water to form a charged molecule. Okay, like lipids, urea, creatinine, glucose are not electrically charged when they are dissolved in water. So those are called non-electrolytes. Okay, now electrolytes have a lot more osmotic power than than the non-electrolytes because electrolytes can uh, can have a charge. Okay, um, now for example, sodium chloride when dissolved in water will split into Na plus. Na stands for sodium, and chloride minus. That means chloride stands for, well, Cl stands for chlorine, right? So if you remember from, say, the muscle physiology or nervous system physiology, sodium and potassium play a very important role in establishing the resting membrane potential, right? So these ions like sodium, potassium, calcium uh, cannot easily pass through the plasma membrane because they are charged, right? So they need special ion channels that allow these molecules to pass through and leave the cell, okay? Now, what can easily cross the membrane? If you remember osmosis, water, right? Water always moves according to the osmotic gradient, okay? It does regardless of the type of solutes contained. Water moves from an area of less osmolality to an area of greater osmolarity, okay? So osmolarity is the number of solutes dissolved in water. Okay, it's the concentration of solutes. So water always moves from an area of less osmolarity to an area of more osmolarity. Okay, and let's just see. Ben, so this over here shows exactly what we talked about. Now here the red blood cell is immersed in a hypertonic solution. Hyper means above. Um, so in a hypertonic solution, water leaves the blood cell and the cells crenate or shrivel, right? That is because water moved from an area of less osmolarity of solutes to an area of high osmolarity of the solutes. Okay, now in a hypotonic environment, water will move into the cell because hypo means below. So hypotonic solution refers to the concentration of solutes outside the cell. So water is going to enter the cell blows up, and sometimes the cell bursts. Okay, so this is something you would have studied in chapter 3 and 4 in Bio 137. If you don't know what osmosis is, go back and read what osmosis is. Okay, now well, as electrolytes dissociate in the liquid, they cause a change in shift in electron potential, but non-electrolytes do not do that. Okay, so electrolytes play a very important role in the clinical setup. Why? Because our body is rich in electrolytes and they conduct electrical current because they have a charge. And electrolytes also have a higher osmotic force. Okay, so what is osmosis? First of all, osmosis is the movement of water, right? And water always moves from an area of less osmolality to an area of greater osmolality, right? So water follows the solute due to osmosis. Okay, and why is this important? Because water follows electrolytes, because electrolytes are the solutes that we are talking about, right? So electrolytes have much more osmotic pressure than non-electrolytes. A good example of non-electrolyte is glucose, right? So these glucose molecules, they remain undissociated, but they still contribute to osmosis to some extent. However, when sodium chloride or magnesium chloride dissociate, they dissociate into two, sometimes three solute molecules that contribute to osmosis to a much larger extent, right? So let's write that down for you to understand. You have NaCl solution. In water, NaCl divides into Na plus and Cl minus. Then you have MgCl2 solution in water. MgCl2 divides into Mg2 plus and 2Cl minus. So magnesium chlorides dissociate into 3 ions, and NaCl divides into 2 ions, right? So water always follows the solute, and the more solute concentration you have, the the um, uh, the water that much more will feel like moving to an area of a high solute concentration. As a result, electrolytes have an ability to cause a larger shift than non-electrolytes in the body. And why do we study this? Because if we know what's going on with the electrolytes, we will know what's going on with the water in the body, right? Because again, let me repeat, water follows solutes due to osmosis. Okay, if you don't remember what osmosis is, you might want to pull out the notes from Bio 137, or whichever subject that taught you osmosis before. Um, Make sure you revise osmosis before moving on, because that is a very, very important concept. Okay, let's take an example of albumin. Now, back in the blood chapter, we talked about how albumin is a very important protein, and albumin affects osmolarity of blood. If you lose albumin proteins, fluids start building up in the tissue, um, rather than returning to the bloodstream in diseases like kwashiorkor. So if you remember, in kwashiorkor, they have protein malnutrition, and the patients affected with kwashiorkor end up having ascites or edema in the abdominal region due to building up of fluids in the abdominal region, right? And that's why it is important to study osmosis, right? And one of the most important solute particles is sodium in the extracellular fluid and potassium in the intracellular fluid. And if you remember muscle physiology and nervous tissue physiology, we talked about how the extracellular fluid is really high in sodium concentration, and intracellular fluid has really high amounts of potassium salts. And this is important. Why? Because this difference in concentration of charges in the extracellular and intracellular fluid um, causes the electron gradient, which when you disturb leads to action potential. So water is the primary fluid in the body. When there's an imbalance in water, uh, uh, our thirst centers in the hypothalamus get triggered and cause us to get thirsty, right? So Water balance or homeostasis, it means that the total water intake equals total water output. And on an average, every individual in the United States drinks about 2000 ml to 2500 ml of water every day. And a lot of water is absorbed by the bloodstream, taken into the tissue, and in the form of dissolved nutrients, the water is taken up by the intracellular and extracellular fluid. Nutrients are supplied to the cells, and all the waste is excreted out of the cell and dissolved in the extracellular fluid. This extracellular fluid in tissues is called interstitial fluid. Okay, so the cells, the fluid in which the cells bathe in the tissue will be called interstitial fluid. The lymphatic system picks up the interstitial fluid, filters the fluid, checks it for antigen, and then returns it back to the bloodstream. And after all of this happens, well, not after, but simultaneously, the kidney constantly filters, electrolytes and water and um, hydrogen ions and creatinine, all the unwanted waste from the body, to excrete it out in the form of urine. So human body, well, we drink and about lose the same amount of water every day, about 2000 to 2500 ml per day. And um, the losses can be in form of perspiration. Well, gains. Let's talk about gain first. So gains come from uh, ingested food, drinks, a lot of moist foods that we drink, a lot of cool drinks, water, beverages, and about 10% of the byproducts in the body is a byproduct of oxidative metabolism, right? Which is also known as water due to metabolic products, right? When we make ATP. Oxygen is the final electron acceptor, so cellular respiration actually produces water as well, right? So um, we also constantly lose water throughout the day. Now, sensible loss, meaning observable loss of water, is from urine. We produce about 1500 ml of urine a day. About 200 ml is lost in the form of feces, and then about 100% is lost in sweat in a resting adult. So we lose about 8% through sweat. And in extreme cases, perspiration rates can reach up to 4 liters per hour. So that's an extreme scenario, right? And fever can also cause water loss. So when a patient has fever, they're told to drink a lot of fluids to offset this loss of water. Now, the insensible water loss is the water loss that is unnoticed in form of expiration. So when we breathe out. Um, we lose about 300 ml of water a day, which we don't really notice. But if stand against the window and you breathe, you see a lot of moisture, right? So about 300 ml of water is lost uh, during breathing. And then you have about 400 ml lost in the form of cutaneous transpiration, wherein we lose water through the epidermis and it just evaporates. Okay, this is not the water that comes from sweat glands. The water that is lost through sweat glands or secreted through sweat glands is sensible or observable um, water loss that we can actually observe, but we don't observe transpiration through the epidermis. Now, this water loss depends on a lot of environmental and physical activity, and it varies from person to person. And all of this must be, offset by thirst, because when we are thirsty, we drink a lot of water. right? When we are thirsty, our hypothalamic thirst center gets activated, which tells you to drink more water, and the body reabsorbs the water that it loses, right? So thirst is a very important mechanism that helps in offsetting all the losses of water throughout the day. Okay. Now, in some conditions like diabetes, a person gets thirsty. Why do you think a person gets thirsty in diabetes? That's because a diabetic has a really high concentration of glucose, meaning the osmolality of the blood is high due to high concentration of glucose. And when the osmolality of the blood plasma increases, it causes the hypothalamic centers, the thirst centers in the hypothalamus to get triggered. And you feel really thirsty because your body tells you to dilute your blood due to high concentration of glucose. And that's why diabetics are constantly thirsty. So the diabetic water loss is the output that is relatively unavoidable, meaning you have to lose some amount of water to survive in form of expiration, that is breathing out air, cutaneous transpiration through the skin, some amount of sweat, now which differs from season to season, then fecal moisture, about 200 ml, and then minimum urine output. So all of this together is called obligate water loss. Okay, we cannot control how much water our body chooses to lose through urine or through expiration or transpiration or sweat or feces. So this is called obligatory water loss. Now this again just shows the water gains and losses in a day. Like I said, for homeostatic balance, water intake equals to approximately equals to the water output in a day. Okay, and the gains come from metabolic water, about 200 250 ml, through the foods we eat, about 700 to 750 ml, and then the liquids we drink, about 1500 1600 ml on an average. But there is a whole bunch of water that we also lose throughout the day through feces, about 200 ml, while breathing air out through expired air, about 300 ml. Then you have cutaneous transpiration through the epidermis, sweat, and urine. So we lose most water through urine, about 1500 ml. Okay, so um, this graph shows the electrolyte composition in body fluids, and you can see that the x-axis is the electrolyte, the y-axis is the total solute concentration. In the body, fluid electrolyte concentrations are most commonly expressed in terms of milliequivalent per liter. Okay, MEQ stands for milliequivalent per liter. This measures the number of electrical charges in 1 liter of solution. Okay, so um, the first thing, okay, let's look at the color codes first. Now, blood plasma is in red over here. So this one over here is blood plasma, and interstitial fluid is represented in blue, and intracellular fluid, meaning the concentration or the the fluids inside the cell, is represented in yellow. So let's look at sodium first. Sodium and potassium, okay? These are the most important electrolytes in the body. Why? Because they help in maintaining the resting membrane potential. If you remember nervous system physiology and action potential, okay? So sodium first. Sodium is present in really high concentrations in the blood plasma and the interstitial fluid, which together make up the extracellular fluids. But very low levels of sodium is found in the intracellular fluid. So how do you get such a difference in concentration? Take a minute and think about it. Now, if you think, or if you remember anything about the sodium potassium pump, you know that sodium potassium pump literally pumps 3 sodium ions out of the cell, okay, and simultaneously pumps in only 2 potassium ions into the cell. This is important. Why? Because this helps in creating the gradient required to generate an action potential. Okay. Now, if you remember, you might have talked about how the concentration of sodium ions is really high on the outside and the concentration of potassium is really high on the inside. Okay, why is this important? Now, in patients who have certain disease conditions like cancer or some kind of internal trauma, um, they might have cells that have burst and have released potassium in the bloodstream, or may have some kidney disease due to which they are not excreting potassium, right? So you can see potassium ions in a normal person is in high concentrations of the intracellular fluid and not so high in the extracellular fluid, which is the plasma and the interstitial fluid. So in patients who have any conditions, may say of the kidney, of say cancer or internal trauma, they might have really high concentrations of potassium in the extracellular fluid. Now let's look at calcium. You can see that calcium levels is really low in plasma and the interstitial fluid. Why? Because calcium is an important molecule that functions like in cell division or release of neurotransmitter, right? So if you have calcium being, present all the time and being active all the time, it will constantly probably trigger a nerve impulse. You don't need that to happen all the time or constantly, right? So the cell does not constantly require a supply of calcium inside and outside of the cell. Our bodies contain about 8.6 to about 10.3 milligram per deciliter of calcium, and of this only 1% calcium in the body is found in the extracellular fluid. Most of the calcium, the remaining 99%, is contained in bones in the form of hydroxyapatite, which is a which is the compound that makes up the bones. And the calcium in body fluids can exist in 3 forms. It can either exist as a free ion, or it can be bound to proteins, or it is complex with other ions. Out of the 3 types, the free cation is the most important physiologically because the concentration of free calcium must be maintained for triggering a muscular impulse or releasing neurotransmitter and so on. Um, so if you see this, it's really interesting that the extracellular fluid does not have much magnesium, but the intracellular fluid, the levels of magnesium is higher than the extracellular fluid. So why do you think that's the case? The magnesium in the intracellular fluid is high because magnesium is very important in stabilizing ATP. And magnesium is also an important cofactor in several biochemical reactions. And if you don't have enough magnesium, you have problems storing ATP, which causes muscle weakness and fatigue. And then you have bicarbonate ions. Bicarbonate ions come from carbonic acid, and the levels of bicarbonate ions is high in the extracellular fluid and low in the intracellular fluid. And this ion helps in stabilizing pH. And then you have the chloride ions. Now, chloride and sodium go hand in hand, okay, because of the sodium ions, when they're absorbed, chloride ions follow, okay, because sodium is positively charged, chloride is negatively charged. and sodium chloride are usually from, table salt, right? So they dissociate in water to form NaNCl minus. So chlorine and sodium, they follow the same pattern. Okay, and then you have phosphates and sulfates. You can see phosphates, you have again the levels of phosphates are high inside the cell, and sulfates are also high inside the cell. Now, sulfates and proteins, etc. Well, sulfates and phosphates are present in proteins and nucleic acid, and that's why you see more of sulfates and phosphates inside the cell rather than outside the cell. The protein concentration is important because any change in protein concentration can be very harmful. If we did look at one example of kwashiorkor that we recently talked about, kwashiorkor is due to low concentration of albumin in blood, which leads to the fluids entering the interstitial space rather than staying in the bloodstream. Okay. Similarly, another harmful effect of sulfates and protein concentration can be cytotoxic edema. Cytotoxic edema is a condition when the neurons lyse and they leak out protein into the extracellular fluid. When this happens, they extract water from the brain tissue and the brain starts to swell. And that's what you call cytotoxic edema. This is not the same as inflammation. Now, inflammation has a totally different mechanism if you remember from immunology and the lymphatic system. Okay, so you really need to know the behavior and the normal concentration of electrolytes in order to understand which direction water will follow due to osmosis. So there are several mechanisms that regulate water intake, and this is a combined effect of the osmoreceptors, increase in thirst, decrease in blood volume or blood pressure. All of these together uh, govern the regulation of water. In the hypothalamus, we have receptors for monitoring osmolarity. Okay, and as little as 1 to 2% change will activate these receptors, um, which will trigger mechanisms for gain or loss of water. So when we have increased osmolarity, meaning we have really high concentration of solutes in the blood, as a result, we lose, we don't secrete enough saliva, which leads to dry mouth. Now, this happens because blood pulls water from the salivary glands due to higher concentration of solutes. So we do not have enough liquids in the salivary glands, which leads to a dry mouth. When this happens, it triggers the activation of the hypothalamic thirst center. Okay, and then we get thirsty, we drink water, then we absorb the water from the GI tract and the plasma osmolarity increase. And when all of this happens, it quenches our thirst and we stop drinking water. Okay. So really increased plasma osmolarity, meaning there's too much solute. In simple terms, there's too much salt dissolved in the blood plasma, and we need to activate mechanisms that retain water and dilute the blood. Okay, so drying mouth is one mechanism. The next mechanism is, the direct activation of the hypothalamic thirst center. Now, there are osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus that sense a change in osmolarity of blood and stimulate thirst. We drink water, the water gets absorbed, and the blood plasma gets diluted. So the osmolarity decreases. Okay. So what else would happen? Now, if you remember from the urinary system, we have granular cells in the juxtamedullary apparatus that secrete renin. And if you remember the renin-angiotensin aldosterone mechanism, right? That gets activated. So let's see how that works out. Now, When you have low plasma volume or increased plasma osmolarity, it means your blood is very concentrated, you're dehydrated. Okay, so you have either low plasma volume or you can say that you have high plasma osmolarity. So when we have low plasma volume, this leads to decreased blood pressure and decreased glomerular filtration rate. This triggers the granular cells in the kidney to secrete renin. Okay, renin is the enzyme and a hormone that leads to the activation of angiotensin 2. And angiotensin 2 makes us thirsty, so we drink a lot of water, and it leads to increase in uh, water absorption. And then eventually, the plasma osmolarity decreases because the blood gets diluted. So one of the most important mechanisms for water regulation is the action of ADH in the collecting duct in nephron. Okay, so the epithelial linings in the nephron are mostly impermeable to water unless there are antidiuretic hormones present. Okay, so when ADH is present, it increases water resorption by activating the aquaporin channels that allow water to easily pass through. So in a healthy individual, the osmolarity of blood, osmolarity of the body fluids is maintained in between 280 to 300 milliosmol. When the concentration of solutes in the plasma increases, the osmolarity in the plasma increases, right? This causes the activation of osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus, which in turn activates the posterior pituitary gland to secrete antidiuretic hormone. When the antidiuretic hormone act upon the collecting ducts of the kidney, they open up or activate the aquaporin channels and allow or increase water reabsorptions in the kidney. Okay, when we increase water reabsorption, we don't pee too much, and then we dilute our blood and decrease the osmolality. So when we have more body fluids, it increases plasma volume, and again, this is a negative feedback inhibition, right? Because once we restore the original osmolarity of the blood body fluids, we need to inhibit water reabsorption, right? So this is called negative feedback mechanism. So I've told you before, if there's one thing that you really need to know in anatomy and physiology, is the difference between feedback inhibition, well, positive feedback inhibition and negative feedback inhibition, because you come across these terms everywhere, right? So um, the other mechanism for regulating water is when there's a well, it's the other mechanism is through baroreceptors in the atria. So these don't get activated unless there is a big change in the blood pressure and plasma volume. Okay, but when there's a significant change in the plasma volume and blood pressure, that is when we have low BP and low plasma volume, the baroreceptors detect a change and stimulate the pituitary gland to release antidiuretic hormone. Okay, and antidiuretic hormone trigger the collecting duct to reabsorb water. Now, antidiuretic hormone is also called vasopressin. Oops, I should write it down. Vasopressin. Now, it is also known as vasopressin because it helps in constricting blood vessels. When you constrict blood vessels, you decrease the diameter. So you increase the blood pressure, just like you hold the tip of the water hose. And when you constrict the water hose and reduce the opening, water flows out with a lot high pressure. A similar thing happens in the bloodstream. When you constrict the blood vessels, you increase the blood pressure. So the thing that mainly governs fluid intake is we feeling thirsty, and the centers for this, like we talked about, is in the hypothalamus. The osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus respond to angiotensin 2 when the BP drops, and they cause rise in osmolarity of the extracellular fluid just by the mechanism we saw earlier. And the osmoreceptors also communicate with other hypothalamic neurons in the cerebral cortex. But keep in mind there are several, these two ADH mechanism and renin angiotensin aldosterone mechanism are the two main mechanisms by which we can increase our water regulation, not increase, we can regulate our water levels. Now, what would happen if there is a decrease in osmolarity? What would happen with respect to ADH? How would ADH hormone behave when there's a decrease in osmolarity? When there's a decrease in osmolarity, it means we do not have enough salt. Okay, so when there's a decrease in osmolarity, it inhibits you from becoming thirsty, and it inhibits antidiuretic hormone. When antidiuretic hormone gets inhibited, we lose more water and we pee a lot. So by now you should understand how important electrolytes are. Electrolytes can be salts, they can be acids, bases, and even some proteins. But electrolyte balance usually refers to the balance of salt. And why are we learning this? Because they are very important in physiological functions. Some electrolytes participate in metabolism because things like magnesium act as cofactors, zinc acts as cofactors, iron acts as cofactors. Now, they also help in determining the electrical potential or the charge across the cell membrane, um, because they help in maintaining a resting membrane potential. The resting membrane potential is important to generate an action potential, right? So the movement of ions, when you disturb the electrical current in a cell, it leads to generation of action potential when a cell reaches the threshold. Now, salt or solutes or electrolytes even affect osmolarity of body fluids because water follows solutes, right? So when this happens, it can drastically affect the condition, body condition, and the physiology of the condition. Now, electrolytes, this is just redundant because water follows solutes. So when you affect the osmolarity of body fluids, you're going to see a change in the movement of water. And we can obtain electrolytes through food that we eat, and we drink Gatorade, and we also lose electrolytes through through feces, through urination, when we vomit or when we perspire, we end up losing a lot of electrolytes, right? The major cations in the body are sodium, potassium. Now, we will focus quite a bit on sodium and potassium and how they affect the resting membrane potential. And then you have calcium, magnesium, hydrogen. Major anions or negatively charged ions include chloride ions, bicarbonate ions, and phosphate ions. Now, you have a high concentration of chloride ions outside the cell than inside the cell. Okay. Um, and then let's revise. Where would you find a lot of sodium ions? In the intracellular fluid or extracellular fluid? If you said extracellular fluid, you're right. And then you see a higher concentration of potassium in the intracellular fluid rather than the extracellular fluid. Now, sodium is one of the most important electrolytes. It helps in maintaining the resting membrane potential because it's present in really high concentrations in the extracellular fluid compared to the intracellular fluid. Now, sodium ions have a charge. Sodium ions are positively charged. So sodium attracts water because water is a polar molecule. So when sodium ion is surrounded by water, you can see this is a positively charged ion, and then this is a water molecule. This is the oxygen molecule, and these are two hydrogen ions in the water molecule. So water molecule has a slight negative charge on the oxygen and a slight positive charge on the hydrogen. These water molecules surround a single sodium ion to form something called as a hydration shell. Okay, this is due to the positive charge on the sodium and the negative charge on the oxygen molecule, slight negative charge on the oxygen molecule. And that's why um, the water follows uh, sodium. And this is also the reason why the osmotic force of sodium ion is high. Okay, so what do you think would happen if you have very little sodium in the extracellular fluid? If you have very little sodium, you will have very less water in the bloodstream, which in turn will lead to low BP. Okay, so the sodium salt accounts for majority of the osmolarity in the extracellular fluid. It contributes to about 90 to 95% of the osmolarity in extracellular fluid, and it is present in really high concentrations outside than the inside. You have very little sodium on the inside, about 15 milliequivalents per liter, but outside you have about 150 milliequivalents per liter of sodium. Okay, so the normal osmolarity of the extracellular fluid is about 280 to 300 milliosmol, and most of the osmolarity is due to the dissolved sodium salts in the blood. And controlling the extracellular volume and water distribution in the blood plasma is largely governed by the concentration of sodium in the plasma. Now, other solutes like glucose and chloride depend on sodium for transportation in and out of the cell. Now, they have sodium glucose importers, wherein glucose tags along with sodium to move back into the cell, and then you have sodium chloride, right? Chloride usually follows sodium because of its negative charge. Okay, so sodium along with potassium also affects other solutes like glucose and chloride. Now, sodium bicarbonate buffer has a major role in maintaining the pH in extracellular fluids as well. So sodium imbalances are very, very rare. When you have very high levels of sodium in the bloodstream, it's called hypernatremia. Now, when they measure electrolytes, they are really looking at the electrolytes in the extracellular fluid. The normal concentration for sodium in the electrolyte is in the extracellular fluid is about 145 milliequivalent. Um, well, it varies in between 130 to 150. Okay, so anything greater than 145, again, this is just an average. It's considered hypernatremia. And what causes hypernatremia? What happens if you have hypernatremia? Now, if you have hypernatremia, the cells in the body will shrink because water follows solute. So water from the cells will leave out and enter the bloodstream, which will cause crenation, right? Hypernatremia will cause crenation of cells. Okay, and what are causes of hypernatremia? Hypernatremia is high amount of salts, right? So this is caused by hyper, let me write that down. This is caused by hypercortisolism. So when your body secretes too much cortisol, it leads to Cushing syndrome. So people with Cushing disease, they end up retaining a lot of salt because of overproduction of a hormone known as aldosterone. Aldosterone. Now, aldosterone is a salt retaining hormone. Some other reasons why a person can have hypernatremia is when they have increased intake of salty food, or if you provide wrong saline solution. So in well, learning osmosis, if you talked about the importance of hypertonic and hypotonic solution, you would have talked about why they use 0.9% saline in the hospital. That is because the in osmolarity of 0.9% saline is almost equal to the osmolarity of the body fluid, which is about 300 milliosmol. Now, if you you know provide hypertonic solutions like 3% saline solution instead of 0.9%, that can cause hypernatremia and increased levels of sodium. Now, the other reason why a person can have hypernatremia is when they have decreased excretion of sodium from the urine, and that can happen when a person is on corticosteroids. Corticosteroids can be used in situations where a person has an allergic reaction, redness, itchy, asthma, uh, arthritis. All of these, they sometimes provide corticosteroids to relieve inflammation, right? So the problem with putting a patient on corticosteroids is that it can cause hypernatremia, meaning increased retention of sodium indirectly, because you're decreasing the excretion of sodium, right? So aldosterone is another hormone that is called a salt retaining hormone, right? So these are several conditions where hypernatremia can be caused. And other thing is thirst impairment and dehydration. So when you don't drink enough water, you basically concentrate your plasma, right? It's important to drink a lot of water to maintain osmolarity of the blood. So hyponatremia is the opposite of hypernatremia. In hyponatremia, the plasma sodium concentration falls below 130 milliequivalent per liter, and the person loses large volumes of sodium from the body, either through sweat or urine, or by drinking too much water. Now, as a result, um, the person might have hyponatremia. But some of the major causes of hyponatremia include problems with aldosterone secretion. The hormone aldosterone is a salt retaining hormone. So if we don't secrete enough aldosterone from the adrenal cortex, we may not be able to retain too much salt, specifically sodium, in the body. Now, the other causes include low sodium intake and overload of fluids, which can, just dilute the extracellular fluids. And then the other important hormone that affects the sodium levels is anti-diuretic hormone. Diuretics make you pee, so anti-diuretic retain water, right? So if we end up having a problem of oversecretion of anti-diuretic hormone, then our body ends up retaining a lot of water, so it dilutes the salts, right? So that can cause hyponatremia. So the the problem is water and sodium are regulated very differently, but we don't want to go into those details just yet. Okay, so we'll go into how water is regulated, and how potassium and other ions and sodium are regulated in the body. Okay. Now, a normal human adult consume about zero point 0.5 grams of sodium per day, but a typical diet in America consists about 3 to 7 grams per day, which is really, really high. So the primary concern is excretion of dietary sodium. The only way you can lose excess sodium is to prevent reabsorption of sodium by the kidney. We have no direct mechanism or hormone that tells your nephron to excrete excess sodium. We can prevent reabsorption by an indirect mechanism that we'll talk about, but there's no direct hormone that tells your nephron to secrete sodium. Okay, so the sodium concentration is highly coordinated by aldosterone hormone. Now this comes again, uh, uh, well, you looked at it in the urinary system, before that in the respiratory system, you looked at it in the cardiovascular system as well. So you should know by now that the renin angiotensin aldosterone mechanism is really, really important. Now, aldosterone is known as the salt retaining hormone. Okay, and regardless of the hormone mechanism, 65% of the sodium ions is reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule. Okay, so we literally absorb almost everything right away in the proximal convoluted tubule, and the remaining 25% of the sodium ion is reabsorbed in the loop of Henle. So do you remember which loop of Henle sodium will be reabsorbed in? It'll be reabsorbed in the ascending loop of Henle, because only the ascending loop of Henle is permeable to sodium ions. So you literally reabsorb everything almost right away. So if you have too much salt in the blood plasma, there's no good way or no easy way of excreting excess sodium from our diet. The only way we can, well, prevent the only way you can lose excess sodium is to prevent reabsorption of sodium by the kidney. And there is another hormone known as atrial natriuretic peptide. Oh, not anti, let me write this down. So we have atrial natriuretic peptide. We'll talk about this a little later, but this is a hormone that plays a very important role in preventing reabsorption of the kidney. And again, sodium is very, very important because water in the filtrate follows sodium. Okay. So the aldosterone hormone plays a very important role in sodium homeostasis because it's called the salt retaining hormone. Aldosterone is secreted by the adrenal cortex of the adrenal gland. And there are two ways by which aldosterone regulates sodium levels. First one is when the sodium levels drop, we know that the blood pressure also drops. So low blood pressure triggers renin release by the kidney, and renin converts angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 hormone stimulates release of aldosterone from the adrenal cortex, and the aldosterone binds to the receptors in the kidney. You'll find receptors for aldosterone in the ascending limb of nephron loop or the loop of Henle. You'll find it in distal convoluted tubule and also the cortical, the collecting duct. And Once aldosterone binds to the receptors in these regions of the kidney, in about half an hour, enough sodium potassium pumps are inserted in the plasma membrane. And the sodium potassium pump starts pulling in sodium. So this is how sodium is reabsorbed in presence of aldosterone. When sodium gets reabsorbed, as usual, um, chloride and water follow passively. Okay. Now, keep in mind, sodium and potassium ions usually move in the opposite direction. Okay, and the tubule, which is the proximal and distal tubules, they reabsorb more sodium and secrete more hydrogen and potassium ions in general. This always co-occur together. When sodium is reabsorbed into the body, hydrogen ions and potassium ions are secreted into the urine. Okay, so that is the first mechanism. Okay, so when we absorb sodium, we absorb water and we absorb chloride ion. Now, the second mechanism is when there's an increased concentration of potassium. Now, I just told you, when you have low sodium levels in the body, it automatically can be assumed that you have higher levels of potassium, okay? Because they always, move in the opposite direction. And when sodium is low, potassium is going to be high. When potassium is low, sodium is going to be high, okay? So the second mechanism is when you have hyperkalemia. Hyper means high levels of potassium. This triggers aldosterone release from the adrenal cortex. And when you have aldosterone being released, it helps in secretion of potassium by the kidney. Okay, and when you secrete potassium, you retain sodium. Okay, this always co-occurs. When you secrete potassium, you retain sodium, and in turn, you increase the water retention in the plasma. Okay, now you've seen of people using salt substitutes, right? Let's just say your patient uh, is using salt substitutes. What would happen if they're using salt substitutes? What is this artificial salt? Sodium-free salt is really potassium chloride. So people who use potassium chloride as salt substitute, they will eventually develop hyperkalemia, and this will kick in the aldosterone mechanism. Aldosterone will actually promote potassium secretion. When you secrete potassium, you end up retaining sodium. So you're going to retain sodium either way. So this sodium salt substitute, sodium-free salt substitute is just a sham, yeah? So hyperkalemia can also in turn lead to hypernatremia, meaning, high levels of sodium. So there's no point of using soil substitutes because you are going to retain sodium either way. Like I said, our body does not have a direct way of secreting salt. The only way we can enhance secretion of sodium is by preventing reabsorption of sodium. Now, when we have a high blood pressure, our heart cells stretch and we secrete a hormone known as atrial, meaning atrium, atrial natriuretic peptides from the heart. Now, these natriuretic peptides act on the kidney and they inhibit secretion of renin and ADH. When this happens, we prevent reabsorption of sodium in the kidney and we lose more water. When we lose more water, the BH, not the pH, the BP or blood pressure gets lowered, and this protects the heart. Now, this doesn't normally happen all the time. Clinically, you only release natriuretic peptides when you have chronic hypertension. Okay, so this is a mechanism by which we lower the blood pressure when we have chronic hypertension. Okay, so if you check somebody and they have really high levels of atrial natriuretic peptide, that's usually when they have chronic hypertension. Okay. Now, there are other mechanisms by which we regulate sodium in the body, like in the presence of estrogen and progesterone hormones. Now, estrogen increases sodium absorption, and hence the perception of bloating and high blood pressure, because pregnant women secrete a lot of estrogen, and in turn they retain a lot more water and sodium. Now, the other time when we retain a lot of sodium is 2 weeks after the beginning of the menses. Progesterone levels skyrocket. So when you have really high levels of progesterone, you lose more sodium and you lose more water. Okay. Now, the other hormones, like stress hormones, also make you retain more salt as well. And of course, sodium homeostasis is largely governed by our salt intake, right? All right, so this picture shows the mechanisms and consequences of atrial natriuretic peptides secreted by the heart cells. Now, what initiates ANP secretion is high blood pressures. Like I said, when in presence of chronic hypertension, people secrete atrial natriuretic peptides. So there are three different mechanisms by which ANP regulates sodium release in the body and in turn affects blood pressure. Okay, so the first mechanism is that with sodium, the atrial natriuretic peptide tells the adrenal cortex not to release aldosterone. When no aldosterone is released, the collecting duct does not retain salt. Okay, and the other mechanism is when by the action of atrial natriuretic peptides on hypothalamus. So ANP tells the hypothalamus not to release antidiuretic hormone, which means we don't get to reabsorb water. Okay, and so sodium follows water, water follows sodium, they both go hand in hand. Okay, so what happens to potassium? So if you lose sodium ions from the body, what do you think would happen to potassium? Potassium gets retained, right? So if you think about it, when you lose a lot of sodium, potassium gets retained in the body. When you retain a lot of sodium, we lose or secrete potassium in the form of urine. Okay, so when this happens, you create another problem, right? When you lose a lot of sodium, you create hyperkalemia or high levels of potassium in the body. Okay, and then the third mechanism is that the atrial natriuretic peptide inhibits the release of renin from the juxtamedullary complex, and in turn they inhibit formation of angiotensin II. And we do not vasoconstrict. If we don't vasoconstrict, it means we vasodilate or open up the blood vessels. When we vasodilate, the blood pressure gets lowered. Now, the three different mechanisms lead to a decrease in blood pressure, and when the blood pressure gets returned to normal, uh, this the heart stops secreting atrial natriuretic peptide. So this is a negative feedback mechanism. That's a good example of negative feedback mechanism. Okay, now what is negative feedback mechanism? The effect is negated, meaning the values are returned back to the set value. It's not an exaggerated effect, right? Like thermostat, when you set the thermostat at say 70 degree Fahrenheit, no matter whether it gets cold or hot, the thermostat will kick in to return the temperature of the room back to 70 degrees Celsius, either by kicking in the heater or by kicking on the AC. Now, potassium imbalances can be one of the most dangerous imbalances in the body. So, increased levels of potassium in the extracellular fluid is called hyperkalemia, and low levels of potassium is called hypokalemia. So, nearly 98 percent of the body's potassium is contained in the intracellular fluid, right? And this is important for maintaining the resting membrane potential. In case of hyperkalemia, meaning high levels of potassium, um, the effects really depend on the rate of imbalance. But in general, hyperkalemia causes decrease in resting membrane potential, and the membrane becomes partially depolarized, right? When this happens, um, it affects the excitability of the cell, right? So it becomes less likely to completely depolarize. Okay, so um, the well, I should say increase excitability. So when it depolarizes, the excitability increases. Okay, so you might want to correct this right over here. And hypokalemia, on the other hand, leads to increase in the resting membrane potential, and it leads to hyperpolarization. Okay, meaning the membrane potential falls below the normal resting membrane potential values, right? So this makes the cell unresponsive. So hypokalemia can make the muscle cells less excitable, and it can cause muscle weakness, it can cause loss of muscle tone, loss of reflexes, and arrhythmias. Um, and hyperkalemia, on the other hand, can increase excitability in the muscle, and they cause muscle twitching. Okay, because the cells become abnormally excitable. So I just want to correct this real quick. So they become abnormal, and sometimes it causes slow onset, and sometimes it inactivates voltage gated sodium channels and all. Okay, so uh, the effects of hyperkalemia and hypokalemia really depend on the rate of imbalance. Now, potassium is very, very, very important. The normal levels of potassium in the extracellular fluid on an average is about 3.5 milliequivalent per liter. It's about 3.5 to 4. And when the levels fall below 3.5, it's called hypokalemia. When the levels go beyond or above 3.5, it's called hyperkalemia. Hypokalemia can cause even death by affecting the normal cardiac function, okay, because it can cause fibrillation. Now, normally we secrete a very small amount of potassium through perspiration and through feces, and we usually eat foods that are rich in potassium. Now, unless we are starving, we get some potassium from the foods we eat, from banana, greens, all the avocados. These are all rich in potassium, right? So um, no matter how many bananas we eat, we don't get hyperkalemia. Why? Because our kidneys are really good at secreting all the excess potassium. So the only time you'll find, hyperkalemia is when your kidneys are either malfunctioning or they're not able to secrete potassium properly, or in patients with internal trauma, or in cancer patients where their cells lyse and they release a lot of potassium into the extracellular fluid. So those are extreme cases. But again, in a normal human being, the nephrons are very, very efficient in secreting excess potassium from the body. Okay. Now, potassium concentration is controlled by active secretion in the distal convoluted tubule and the in the nephron. Okay, and there are three factors that control how potassium ion secretion varies. Okay, the first one is the concentration. Okay, it is regulated by the concentration in extracellular fluid. And the second one is the pH. And the third condition is the level of aldosterone. So these are the three conditions that determine the tubular secretion of potassium. Um, Now, like I said, potassium is very, very important. It's an important part of the buffer. They shift in and out in the opposite direction of, well, the hydrogen ion shifts in and out in the opposite direction of potassium. So if potassium goes in, hydrogen ions go out. Okay, and this happens to allow maintenance of cation balance. Okay, to maintain the balance of the positive charges. Now, this affects pH as well. Now, if your body becomes acidosis, meaning you have pH below normal, uh, the normal pH of the body is 7.35 to 7.45. When the pH falls below 7.35, it's called acidosis, right? So when you have acidosis, the potassium levels increase because if your body is acidic, the nephron tries to get rid of hydrogen ions, right? So they lose hydrogen ions and retain potassium. Now, if you become acidic, what do you think will happen to the muscles in acidosis? Acidosis will lead to rise in the potassium levels in the muscles, correct? So this in turn will increase the polarity of the muscles and make them a lot more excitable. And this leads to muscle twitching, cramps in the muscles, restlessness, anxiety, it causes arrhythmia, etc. Okay, and now let's talk about alkalosis. Alkalosis is the condition where the pH goes beyond 7.45. So if you have a pH of blood plasma more than 7.45, it's called alkalosis. And if you have alkalosis, the potassium levels fall because the kidney tries to retain hydrogen ions and gets rid of potassium ions. Okay, now like I said, the kidney is very effective in releasing excess potassium, and that's why no matter how many greens and avocados and bananas you eat, you do not end up getting hyperkalemia, right? And the two things, well, the three things that control secretion of potassium is concentration in the extracellular fluid, pH, and aldosterone. Now, aldosterone, you remember, aldosterone is a salt retaining hormone. When we talk of salt, we generally are talking about sodium ions and not potassium, okay? So aldosterone is a salt retaining hormone. If you remember, sodium and potassium follow opposite direction. If you pump sodium in, potassium moves in the opposite direction. Potassium moves out. Okay, so in the presence of aldosterone, we end up retaining a lot more sodium and we end up secreting a lot more potassium. And the adrenal cortex is actually very, very, very sensitive to potassium levels in the body. So when we have high levels of potassium in the body, aldosterone kicks in and they trigger the mechanisms for retaining sodium in the body. When we retain sodium, we in turn end up losing potassium from the body. So the next ion is calcium ions. Now calcium, we have about 1200 milligram of calcium in the body. Most of it is present in the form of hydroxyapatite in the bones. So 99% of calcium is in the bones. Only 1% is present in the body fluids. Out of that 1%, most of the calcium ions is present in the ionic form, and the others are maybe present attached to proteins or enclosed in sarcoplasmic reticulum. So um, there are several functions of calcium ions. First one is to strengthen the skeleton because calcium helps in formation of hydroxyapatite, uh, which is the ceramic portion of bone. And then they activate the sliding filament model. So calcium binds to troponin molecule. If you remember from muscle physiology, calcium binds to troponin, and troponin changes conformation and pulls tropomyosin, and it makes the binding sites available for binding of myosin heads. So they help in muscle contraction. They also serve as secondary messengers for some hormones and neurotransmitters like acetylcholine. So when there's an action potential, calcium ions enter the axon terminal and bind to the vesicles containing neurotransmitter, and they help in exocytosis of the neurotransmitters and other cellular secretion. Okay, and they're also an essential factor in clotting of blood. Okay, now calcium must be maintained at very low intracellular levels, but at the right levels. Okay, so you don't want too much calcium because calcium must well, sometimes they combine with other ions like phosphates to form crystals, and this happens in well, kidney stones and in gout, and the cells must pump out any excess calcium and keep the intracellular concentration low. Okay, a lot of calcium ions is present in the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, and it's only released at the time of need. The calsequestrin is a calcium binding protein that acts as a calcium buffer in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So this protein basically helps hold the calcium in the sarcoplasmic reticulum after muscle contraction. Okay. Uh, so unless an action potential is triggered, uh, the sarcoplasmic reticulum does not release this particular calcium that is bound to calsequestrin. So calcium ion concentrations are largely regulated by three hormones: PTH, which is parathyroid hormone; calcitriol, which is produced by the kidney. Calcitriol is just vitamin D. And then calcitonin is very important in children. Okay, um, the calcium levels are raised by parathyroid hormone and calcitriol, and calcitonin does the opposite. Okay, because calcitonin helps in reducing calcium levels in the bloodstream. That is especially important in children because children that are actively growing have a really uh, higher rate of calcium deposition on the bones. So when we deposit calcium into the bones from the blood, you end up lowering the amounts of blood calcium levels. Now we don't need too much calcium. We have very little calcium levels and we must only absorb about zero point 0.8 to 1.2 grams of calcium per day. That's a very small amount, right? And calcium absorption is usually stimulated by the parathyroid hormone and calcitriol. So it's absorbed in the digestive tract uh, by the body, and it is reabsorbed in the distal convoluted tubules. So on the way to formation of urine, if we need more calcium, it can be reabsorbed in the distal convoluted tubule of the nephron. So this picture over here shows calcium homeostasis and the effects of parathyroid hormone on calcium homeostasis. So when the calcium levels in blood is low, it's called hypocalcemia, and the normal level is 4.5 milliequivalent per liter. So when we have low blood calcium, the parathyroid gland releases parathyroid hormone. The parathyroid hormone has three different functions. The first one is to increase osteoclast activity. Osteoclasts are bone crushers, meaning they resorb bone to release calcium into the bloodstream. Okay, and then they increase calcium reabsorption in the distal convoluted tubule of the kidney. And the third function is the activation of calcitriol by the kidney. Okay, so all these three mechanisms help in increasing blood calcium levels. When the blood calcium levels get restored to normal, the parathyroid hormone release is inhibited. So again, it is a negative feedback mechanism. So low levels of calcium in the blood is called hypocalcemia. It is caused by things like vitamin D deficiency, diarrhea, pregnancy, acidosis, lactation, hypoparathyroidism, and hyperthyroidism, which leads to excessive secretion of calcitonin. All of these conditions can cause hypocalcemia, and when you have hypocalcemia, it increases the membrane permeability for sodium ions. When this happens, it increases the resting membrane potential, right? So normally your sodium ions cannot pass through the cell membrane, but when they pass through, they can enter the cell and they can increase the resting membrane potential, and this makes the cell easily excitable and can cause abnormally excitable muscles and nerve tissues. Okay, and people might end up having tetany or muscle spasms, laryngeal spasms, or even death. Because if you have a tetany, or if your bronchial muscles end up having a spasm, obviously it will disrupt respiration, so you won't be able to breathe, so you'll choke, right? It also causes something called as uh, paresthesia. Paresthesia. Paresthesia is a pin and needle sensation due to overactive muscles and nerves. Okay, that pin and needle sensation in the hands and legs, if you've heard people say that. Okay, so hypercalcemia is the concentration of calcium above 5.8 milliequivalent per liter. This can be caused by conditions like alkalosis, hyperthyroidism, or hypothyroidism. Okay, so hypercalcemia is caused by hyperparathyroidism and also by hypothyroidism, because hypothyroidism affects the secretion of calcitonin um, from the thyroid gland. And I mean, okay, in hypercalcemia, the uh, neurons and muscle cells get inhibited because it reduces membrane permeability of sodium. And this inhibits depolarization of nerves and muscles. And when this happens, it causes muscle weakness, decreased reflexes, and cardiac arrhythmia. Now, hypercalcemia in general, calcium levels is majorly regulated by parathyroid hormone, and it is released by the parathyroid gland when calcium levels are low, and that's what we looked at right over here. Okay, make sure you know how parathyroid hormone regulates calcium levels. Now, there are parathyroid secreting lung cancers, and these types of lung cancer, uh, lead to oversecretion of parathyroid hormone. So, what do you think will happen to vitamin D? It increases, right? Because parathyroid hormone activates uh, calcitriol formation or vitamin D formations in the kidney. Now, the problem is that vitamin D is made from cholesterols. So, when you have cancers that lead to oversecretion of parathyroid hormone, you make too much vitamin D, so you use up too much cholesterol, so you end up having really low cholesterol. So you start with one issue and you end up having other issues, right? So you can see how one thing is connected to another. That's what physiology is all about.